He arrived like a storm front, silent and severe, blotting out the pale afternoon sun that filtered through the drawing-room windows. Duke Alistair Beaumont. The name itself was a fortress, spoken in hushed and reverent tones throughout the county. He was a man made of iron and shadow, the reclusive master of the vast Blackwood Manor that bordered our own crumbling estate. My stepmother, Lady Honoria, had been angling for this visit for months, a campaign waged with cloying letters and strategic appearances at the village church, all for the benefit of her daughter, my stepsister Clara. Elara, for heaven's sake, make yourself useful. And try not to look so gray, Honoria had hissed at me moments before the Duke's carriage was spotted on the drive. I was a creature of gray in her world, a washed-out watercolor next to Clara's vibrant oil painting. Clara, with her sunshine hair and laughter like wind chimes, was currently positioned near the pianoforte, a vision in rose-colored silk. I, in my drab Governess attire, was instructed to manage the tea service and then melt into the background, a ghost at my own family's feast. My father, Lord Vance, a man who had long ago retreated into the dusty pages of his books, hovered near the fireplace, looking deeply uncomfortable. He offered the Duke a weak, watery smile, which Alistair Beaumont did not return. The Duke's gaze was unnervingly direct, a sweep of glacial blue that seemed to take in the room's faded grandeur, Clara's practiced blush, Honoria's predatory smile, and my father's academic stoop in a single dismissive glance. His eyes, for a fraction of a second, landed on me as I poured the tea. I felt the weight of that look like a physical touch, and I flinched, spilling a drop of amber liquid onto the polished silver tray. "Clumsy thing," Honoria muttered under her breath, the words sharp as needles. She smiled brightly at the Duke. "You must forgive Elara, Your Grace. She is my late husband's daughter, a quiet, bookish sort, entirely unsuited for society, I'm afraid. We do our best, but she has none of Clara's sparkle." The cruelty of it was breathtakingly casual. To be dismissed so thoroughly, to be rendered null and void in my own home, was a pain so familiar it had become a dull, constant ache in my chest. I kept my eyes down, my world shrinking to the tremor in my hands, the steaming porcelain cup, the damning dark spot on the silver. I was a smudge, a mistake, a footnote in the story of my own family. I willed myself to become smaller, to disappear into the heavy damask curtains behind me. But the Duke did not reply to Honoria. He did not turn his attention to the radiant Clara. Instead, the silence in the room stretched, pulled taut by an invisible hand until it felt it might snap. Then came the sound of his boots on the worn Aubusson carpet, a slow, deliberate tread that stopped directly in front of me. I did not dare to look up. I could feel the heat of his presence, smell the clean, cold scent of winter air and old leather clinging to his coat. "I require a wife," he said. The words were not loud, but they landed in the suffocating silence with the force of a dropped cannonball. "By tomorrow." A collective gasp went through the room. My stepmother's painted smile froze on her face. My father looked up from his study of the floorboards, his mouth agape. Clara's blush deepened to a mortified crimson. I remained perfectly still, a statue carved from humiliation, certain this was some new, elaborate form of torture I could not yet comprehend. The Duke's voice, when he spoke again, was directed at the top of my head. "Miss Vance." He meant me, not Clara, me. "You will do." I finally lifted my gaze. His face was all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, a face that looked as though it had never known laughter. But his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, were not cold. They were assessing, intent, and they were fixed solely on me. He saw me. In a room where I had been trained to be invisible, this terrifying, powerful man saw me. The shock of it was so profound, the tea tray slipped from my numb fingers and crashed to the floor in a symphony of shattering porcelain and splintering hope. I was bundled into his carriage before my stepmother could recover her senses enough to form a coherent protest. The ride to Blackwood Manor was a blur of wrought iron gates, ancient oak trees, and a suffocating silence that felt heavier than any words. I sat opposite him, my hands clenched in the lap of my gray dress, my mind a maelstrom of fear and disbelief. This had to be a mistake, a cruel joke, or perhaps I was the pawn in some grand, incomprehensible game between him and my family. Men like him did not choose women like me. Women like me were the scenery, not the prize. His home was like him, immense, imposing, and steeped in a profound quiet. We were shown into a library that stole my breath away. It was not a room, it was a cathedral dedicated to the written word. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound volumes soared towards a coffered ceiling. A rolling ladder leaned against one wall, a silent invitation. In the center of the room, a massive oak desk stood like an altar. This was a place of intellect and solitude, and for the first time since leaving my own home, a flicker of something other than terror sparked within me. He dismissed the hovering housekeeper with a nod and gestured for me to sit in one of the deep leather armchairs by the unlit hearth. He remained standing, a dark silhouette against the tall, mullioned windows. "I imagine you have questions, Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the thousands of books surrounding us. My own voice was a thread, thin and weak. "This is a misunderstanding, Your Grace. You must have mistaken me for my stepsister." "I do not make mistakes," he stated, the words flat and final. "I am 30 years old tomorrow. An arcane clause in my grandfather's will stipulates that if I am not married by my 30th birthday, the control of the Beaumont fortune and estates reverts to a board of trustees headed by my grasping cousin. I have no interest in marriage, but I have less interest in seeing my family's legacy dismantled by a fool." It was a business proposition, a cold, logical transaction. My heart, which had been hammering against my ribs, slowed to a painful, heavy thud. Of course, it had nothing to do with me, not really. I was a convenience, a tool, the gray, quiet girl nobody would miss, who could be slotted into the role of Duchess without causing any social ripples or emotional complications. The humiliation I'd felt earlier returned, sharper this time because it was laced with a sliver of disappointed hope I hadn't even realized I was harboring. "You need a wife," I clarified, my voice gaining a small measure of strength. "Any wife." "Not just any," he corrected, and he moved from the window to stand before the hearth. The firelight was absent, but the fading afternoon cast his severe features in shades of gray stone. "I chose you specifically," I stared at him, bewildered. "But why? As my stepmother so helpfully pointed out, you are the woman who, 3 weeks ago, stood by the old Roman bridge on the edge of my property and debated the principles of the voussoir arch with my head stonemason," he said, his eyes fixed on my face. "You spoke of load-bearing capacity and the brilliance of Roman concrete. You did not speak of bonnets or gossip or the latest ball in London. You spoke of things that have endured. The memory surfaced, a small private moment of joy in a life that held so few. I had been on one of my solitary walks, my only escape from the stifling atmosphere of my home. Mr. Finch, the stonemason, had been lamenting a crack in the parapet, and I, forgetting my station, had simply joined the conversation, losing myself in the elegant, logical beauty of ancient architecture, a passion inherited from my late mother. I hadn't realized anyone was watching, least of all, him. He continued, "I also chose you because I witnessed the casual cruelty with which you were treated. A woman of your intellect and composure does not deserve to be a shadow in another's home. I'm offering you a different arrangement, a contract." He laid it out in stark, simple terms. A marriage in name only. He would secure his inheritance, I would secure my freedom. I would be the Duchess of Blackwood. I would have my own wing of the manor, a generous and independent income, and unrestricted access to this library. He would expect me to perform the public duties of a duchess when required, but in private, our lives would be our own. It was a gilded cage, but a cage of my own choosing. It was an escape. It was a life. It was more than I had ever dared to dream of. But as I looked at this powerful, unreadable man, a lifetime of being overlooked and undervalued rose up in me, not as fear, but as a sudden, startling surge of defiance. If I was to do this, it would be on my terms, not just his. "I accept," I said, and the words felt solid, real, in the quiet room. "But I have conditions, 3 of them." For the first time, a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even respect, crossed his face. State them. I took a deep breath, meeting his gaze directly. First, this is to be a partnership of minds, as you yourself have suggested. It is a contract, not a purchase. There will be no other expectations. My rooms will be my own, and I will have my privacy. Agreed, he said without hesitation. Second, I pressed on, my courage growing, I will not be a silent ornament. I will perform the social duties you require, but I will also continue my studies. I want a voice, not in your business affairs, but in matters of this estate's history, the preservation of its architecture. I will not be a duchess who merely hosts teas. I will be a duchess who contributes. He inclined his head, a slow, thoughtful gesture. A reasonable, and, I might add, welcome stipulation. The Beaumont archives are extensive. They would benefit from a scholarly eye. And third, I said, my voice dropping slightly, the final condition the most important, the one that laid my bruised soul bare. You must never, ever pity me. You saw what happened in my home. You may have chosen me for it, but you will not treat me as a rescued creature. You will not look at me with pity. We are to be equals in this arrangement, partners, or I will not do it. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt as though he were reading the very text of my thoughts. I expected him to refuse, to dismiss this final audacious demand, to laugh, but he did not. Your terms are accepted, Miss Vance, he said, his voice softer than I had yet heard it. I have never had any intention of pitying you. I have only the intention of respecting you. He extended a hand. Do we have an accord? I looked at his outstretched hand, strong and unadorned. This was it. The precipice, the moment my life cleaved into a before and an after. I placed my trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and utterly steady. We have an accord, Your Grace. The next 24 hours were a whirlwind. A special license was procured. A quiet ceremony was performed in the Duke's private chapel, witnessed only by his solicitor and a severe but not unkind housekeeper named Mrs. Gable. I wore a simple cream dress that she had found for me, one that had belonged to the Duke's mother. It fit as if it were made for me. I did not see my family. A letter had been sent informing them of the fait accompli. I could only imagine Honoria's apoplectic rage, and the thought gave me a grim, unfamiliar satisfaction. I was now the Duchess of Blackwood. The title felt like a costume, ill-fitting and strange. I was shown to my rooms, a beautiful suite in the east wing overlooking a formal garden, stark and geometric even in the grip of winter. The rooms were lovely, but it was the library that felt like home. Our first few weeks as husband and wife were a study in polite distance. We took our meals together in a dining hall, so vast our voices seemed to get lost on their way to the ceiling. Our conversation was stilted, careful. We were two strangers navigating the strange architecture of our arrangement, yet every evening, as if by unspoken agreement, we would both find our way to the library. He would work at his massive desk, poring over ledgers and maps of his tenants' farms. I would curl up in the armchair by the fire, which Mrs. Gable now ensured was always blazing, a book in my lap. At first we did not speak. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the rustle of his papers, and the soft turn of my pages. But the silence between us was not the suffocating silence of the carriage. It was a comfortable, shared quiet, a peace. Then, one evening, I was reading a treatise on Gothic vaulting, and I made a small sound of frustration. The author misunderstands the function of the flying buttress entirely, I said, more to myself than to him. From across the room, his voice came, startling me. He focuses on the aesthetic, not the engineering. A common mistake. I looked up. He was watching me, a massive architectural folio open before him. You've read it? Years ago, he said. I found it wanting. He rose from his desk and walked over to the shelves, pulling down a heavy, dust-covered volume. He placed it on the small table beside my chair. This offers a more robust analysis. It was written by a master builder in the 15th century. And just like that, the dam broke. Our conversations began tentatively at first, then with a growing, eager momentum. We spoke of architecture, of history, of philosophy. I discovered his mind was as sharp and well-structured as the buildings he admired. He discovered, I think, that my own mind was not the fallow ground my stepmother had always claimed it to be. He would ask my opinion on plans for restoring a dilapidated folly on the estate, and he would listen, truly listen, to my answers. He would leave books for me on the library table, books he thought I would appreciate, his choices unerringly perfect. I began to see the man behind the formidable title. I saw the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the immense weight of responsibility he carried. One night he spoke of his younger brother, Thomas, who had died in a riding accident on this very estate 5 years prior. "He was the artist," Alistair said, his voice rough with an old, unhealed grief. He stared into the fire, but I knew he was seeing something else entirely. I was meant to be watching him. I was the older brother. I was distracted by some estate matter, a dispute over fencing. He shook his head, a gesture of self-loathing. He took a jump he wasn't ready for. I built these walls around myself after that. It was easier to be the Iron Duke than to be the brother who failed. In that moment, my heart ached for him. It was an impulsive, unthinking gesture, but I reached out and laid my hand over his on the arm of his chair. It was the first time we had touched since the wedding chapel. He flinched, but he did not pull away. His hand turned, his fingers lacing with mine. It was not a gesture of passion, but of a profound, shared humanity, a quiet acknowledgement of pain. "That is too heavy a burden for one person to carry," I whispered. He looked at me then, his glacial blue eyes thawed by a sorrow so deep it was bottomless, and for the first time I saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. It was a sad, fleeting thing, but it transformed his face, hinting at a warmth I had never imagined. The connection between us, forged in the cool logic of books and blueprints, was now glowing with a different kind of heat. I was no longer just his partner in contract. I was becoming his confidant, and I, who had never expected to feel anything but gratitude, was falling in love with my husband. The fragile peace of our new world was shattered by the arrival of a letter bearing my father's seal. Alistair read it at the breakfast table, his face hardening back into the impenetrable mask I had first seen. Without a word, he passed it to me. The handwriting was Honoria's, though the letter was signed by my father. It was a masterpiece of saccharine malice. She wrote of her deep concern for my well-being, her fears for my delicate constitution. And then came the poison. She wrote of my mother's illness, twisting her periods of deep, quiet sadness into a narrative of dangerous instability and hereditary madness. She painted me as a ticking time bomb of insanity, a fragile creature unfit to be a duchess, a danger to the Beaumont line. The letter ended with a thinly veiled threat: annul the marriage and provide a generous settlement to the Vance family for our trouble, or she would be forced to share her concerns with the whole of society. The blood drained from my face. I felt cold, exposed, violated. The one secret, tender wound of my past, the memory of my beautiful, sad mother, had been weaponized and used against me. I looked at Alistair, my heart fracturing. He would believe her. Of course he would. It was the perfect explanation for the strange, quiet girl he had married out of convenience. He would see me now not as his intellectual partner, but as damaged goods. Pity. The one thing I had forbidden. "Alistair," I began, my voice choked. He held up a hand, his expression unreadable. "Say nothing," he commanded, but his tone was not harsh. He folded the letter with precise, angry movements. "Order the carriage, Mrs. Gable," he said to the housekeeper who had just entered the room. "We are paying a visit to Lord Vance." My terror was a living thing, a cold serpent coiling in my stomach. The confrontation I had dreaded was here. He was taking me back to be disposed of, to have the contract neatly severed. I had been a fool to hope, a fool to feel. I had flown too close to the sun, and now my waxen wings were melting. When we arrived at my old home, my father, stepmother, and Clara were already assembled in the drawing room, the same room where my life had so irrevocably changed. Honoria wore a look of triumphant concern. My father wrung his hands. Clara looked merely confused. They had been summoned, and they had clearly expected Alistair to arrive alone. My presence unsettled them. Alistair did not waste time with pleasantries. He stood before the fireplace, a commanding, immovable presence, and I stood slightly behind him, feeling like a ghost once more. "I received your letter, my lord," he said, his voice dangerously soft as he addressed my father, though his eyes were fixed on Honoria. He held up the venomous pages. "An interesting piece of fiction," Honoria simpered. "Your Grace, I assure you it is with the heaviest of hearts that we felt compelled to share such a delicate family matter. Our only concern is for Elara's health and, of course, the protection of your great name." "My name is not in need of your protection, madam," Alistair cut in, his voice like chipping ice. "Nor is my wife's health your concern." He let that sink in. "My wife." He said the words with a possessive weight that made me straighten my spine. He then produced another document from his coat pocket, a sheaf of papers tied with a ribbon. "You see, when I marry, I consider my wife's interests my own, and I'm a man who protects his interests, so I took the liberty of having my solicitors look into the Vance estate, specifically the trust left to Elara by her mother, the late Lady Vance." My father paled. Honoria's simpering smile faltered. "It is a fascinating account," Alistair continued, his voice still deceptively calm. "It shows a trust fund that should have amounted to a considerable dowry, a fund that has, over the last 10 years, been systematically drained, small amounts at first, then larger, for gowns, for carriages, for gambling debts." His eyes were now locked on Honoria, and they were utterly merciless. "Forgeries of your husband's signature, investments in failing schemes. You have been stealing from your stepdaughter since the day you married her father." "Lies," Honoria shrieked, her mask of civility shattering. "It's all lies. He is a weak fool. He let me handle everything." She pointed a trembling finger at my father. My father, for the first time in a decade, seemed to awaken from his long slumber. He stared at his wife, the woman for whom he had sacrificed his daughter's happiness, and saw her for what she was. "Honoria, you swore to me that Elara's trust was untouched." "And as for Elara's mother," Alistair went on, his voice cutting through the rising chaos, "I'm also aware of her condition, a deep melancholy that afflicted her after the loss of a child before Elara was born. A sorrow, not a madness, a sorrow you have twisted into a weapon to blackmail her daughter." Honoria's face was a mottled mask of rage and fear. She turned on me, her eyes spitting venom. You ungrateful wretch, after everything I did for you, I gave you a roof over your head. You were always a sullen, plain, worthless little thing. You should be on your knees thanking me for not turning you out into the street." And in that moment, something inside me shifted. The fear was gone, burned away by a clean, white-hot anger. But it was not the screeching anger of my stepmother. It was cold and clear as a winter morning. I stepped out from behind Alistair, my voice steady and quiet, yet it carried across the room with more power than all her shrieking. "A roof over my head?" I asked, my gaze meeting hers without flinching. "You gave me a cage. You taught me that my only worth lay in being invisible. You fed me a diet of insults and disdain and told me it was for my own good, but you were wrong." I looked at her, at this woman who had held such dominion over my life, and I felt nothing but a profound emptiness where my fear used to be. The truly worthless thing, Honoria, is a life spent climbing over others. The truly plain thing is a soul that can only see value in titles and coin. You tried to make me small, but you only succeeded in making yourself ugly. I do not hate you. I don't even fear you anymore. I simply pity you. My third rule, the one I had given my husband, I was now applying it to my tormentor, and it was liberating. Clara, who had been watching in wide-eyed horror, finally spoke. "Mother, stop," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's true, all of it. I saw it. I never said anything." She looked at me, her expression full of a shame that was years overdue. "I'm so sorry, Elara." The fight went out of Honoria. She collapsed into a chair, her face a ruin. My father looked at me, his eyes filled with a deep, pathetic remorse. The battle was over. Alistair had not rescued me. He had simply cleared the field so that I could rescue myself. That evening, back at Blackwood, I stood on the stone balcony outside my rooms. The winter air was sharp and clean, and the sky was a canvas of bruised purple and glittering stars. I felt hollowed out, but clean. The poison had been lanced. I heard footsteps behind me and knew it was him. Alistair came to stand beside me, not touching, just sharing the cold, quiet air. "I never believed her," he said softly. "Not for a moment." "Thank you." I whispered, my voice thick with unshed tears. For giving me my voice back. I gave you nothing, he countered, turning to face me. The starlight softened the harsh lines of his face. Your voice was always there, Elara. You just needed a quiet place to hear it yourself. He hesitated, and then a rare, genuine smile touched his lips. Although I confess I may have broken one of our rules. I looked at him, confused. Which one? The third, he said, his gaze intense. I do not pity you, but I find I can no longer treat you as an equal. My heart sank, but he continued, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur. Because in my estimation, you have far surpassed me. In courage, in resilience, in grace. I find myself looking up to you, Elara. He took a step closer, his hands coming up to gently cup my face. His touch was electric, a jolt of warmth against my cold skin. Our contract was for a partnership of minds, but my heart, it seems, did not read the terms. It has become entirely irrevocably yours. I love you, Elara, not the Duchess of Blackwood. You. Tears I had refused to shed in front of my stepmother now traced hot paths down my cheeks. Alistair, I would like to renegotiate our accord, he whispered, his thumb brushing away a tear. Specifically, your first rule. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. I would very much like to be your husband, in every sense of the word, if you will have me. I could not speak. I could only lean into his warmth, my hands rising to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath my palms. I lifted my face to his, and that was all the answer he needed. His kiss was not the stuff of frivolous romance novels. It was deep and sure and profoundly real. It was the end of a very long winter. It was the feeling of being found after a lifetime of being lost. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock I never knew I was trapped behind. In the starlight, on a cold stone balcony, the quiet governess and the Iron Duke sealed a new contract, one written not on paper, but on the soul. 1 year later, the summer sun warmed the ancient stones of the unearthed Roman villa. Alistair and I knelt side by side, carefully brushing dirt from a section of mosaic flooring. The design was intricate, a swirling pattern of vines and birds miraculously preserved for centuries. My book on the architectural history of the Beaumont estate was due to be published in the autumn, and this villa was its crown jewel. Alistair's hand found mine, his fingers, stained with the same rich earth as my own, lacing through mine. What are you thinking about? He asked, his voice the familiar, beloved melody of my life. I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. I was thinking about voussoir arches, I confessed, and how sometimes the most unlikely stone, the one that seems plain and gray, turns out to be the keystone, the one that holds everything together. He turned his head and kissed my temple. A sound architectural principle, he agreed, his eyes crinkling in a smile that was now as familiar to me as my own reflection. My father and Clara were due to visit for luncheon. After Honoria's disgrace and departure for the continent, my father had slowly, painstakingly, begun to rebuild his relationship with me. Clara, free from her mother's influence, was discovering a personality of her own, one that was surprisingly thoughtful and kind. The healing was slow, but it was real. Mrs. Gable now ruled our household with an iron fist and a heart of gold, treating me with a fierce, protective affection. I looked across the rolling green hills of our home, at the man beside me, my partner, my friend, my love. For so many years I had defined myself by my invisibility, by the space I failed to occupy in the lives of others. But Alistair had not given me worth. He had simply seen the worth that was there all along. He had not saved me from the shadows. He had walked into them, taken my hand, and shown me that they were powerless against the light we could create together. I was no longer a footnote. I was the author of my own story. I was Elara, Duchess of Blackwood, and I was, finally and completely, seen.